Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Randy Bach, and I'm here with Jeff Peel. You're going to love this guy. He's great speaker, eloquent, articulate, and with a wonderful Northern Ireland accent. So his name is Jeff Peel. He's a market analyst, and he has some really fascinating experience. He's been kind of through the belly of the beast. We'll leave it there. In dealing with some of the absurdities and the maybe regular bureaucracy, maybe those are redundant terms, through COVID-19, COVID-20, COVID-21, COVID-22, et cetera. Jeff, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and why are you involved in this at all?
Well, yeah. First of all, Randall, it's lovely to be with you, and thank you very much indeed for inviting me onto your show. Why am I involved? Well, I was just absolutely appalled at what happened from March 2020. I'd spent about 20 years running my own business, advising companies, particularly technology companies, on how they should proceed and how they should get their products to market. Spent a lot of time in the United States working with a variety of companies. And when the so-called pandemic hit, I was working for the UK government, in fact, for the Department for International Trade as an advisor and a consultant. And I just couldn't believe what had happened. I couldn't believe that entire nations were being locked down, that business owners were having their livelihoods destroyed. That people ultimately were being forced to take a medical intervention that they didn't want, that those medical interventions were being mandated, particularly on public workers. And as a result of that, I resigned from my consultancy role in government so that essentially I could add my voice to some of those people who were dissenting from the view that the government's policy was appropriate, given the fact that essentially we were facing a jumped up cold. And I just became increasingly frustrated and annoyed when clearly people were being deplatformed. I had been a consultant to many companies and had been and paid lots of money over the years, over those decades, for my best advice. And suddenly I and many others like me were being deplatformed and silenced. I had, I was making video content, for example, to try to convey the fact that some of the government's policies were utterly inappropriate, and that some of the testing policies, for example, the PCR test was an inappropriate way to test for a respiratory virus. And that content was being pulled from platforms like Facebook. It was clear that Twitter was deplatforming certain individuals, many of whom I was working with and alongside, like Nick Hudson of Pandata in South Africa. And I sort of fell into this whole world. I was a sort of commoner garden businessman trying to make a living, and then found myself essentially becoming a sort of putative freedom fighter.
No, it's a fact. The people in the resistance. I mean, I've been calling it the COVID resistance. With that, flair for potentially slightly aggrandized, the French resistance and so forth. After the war, everyone was a resistance fighter. Nobody was a collaborator and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that was before social media and before web archives. So I've been taking names, and I'm not ready to quite go on a victory tour, but it seems that let's be frank, we were right. We were right about everything. There's these lists coming out. We were right about Wuhan. We were right about natural immunity. We were right about lockdowns. We were right about harming kids, being ineffective. We were right about, avoiding vaccines for young people, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, but what were the steps along the way that made you notice there was a problem in government, and what was the purpose of resignation? And was there any purpose in sticking around and fighting? Was resignation the only possibility? How did that play out? And what were your actions and goals thereafter?
Well, one of my roles in government, and particularly working for the Trade Department, it's very similar to the US Trade Department. If you're working on behalf of US companies, you need to go out and tell the world about what those American companies are doing.
Mm-hmm.
And there I was working as a consultant to the Trade Department, and was unable to travel. And here I had these wonderful little companies that I was working with, UK companies, wonderfully innovative, needed desperately to get out of the United Kingdom and maybe appeal to US venture capital companies in order to fund their innovation.
Right.
Of course, I couldn't travel. And we were doing Zoom calls, and we were, doing this and that. And I ended up writing, helping with policy documents and so on and so forth. But effectively, I wasn't able to do what I should have been doing. I could see no clear logic for these ludicrous interventions or these ridiculous regulations. We know all about them. They've been all over Twitter, the ludicrous things that we had to do. And I instinctively, as many of us did, thought these are absolutely ridiculous. We have to do something about these things. And of course, the inability to travel as well, that is a fundamental right. The ability, we over decades, we built up relations with our international partners. We used to hear lots of talk about the special relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States. And here I was unable to travel to the United States. And incidentally, many people across the world can't yet travel to the United States and conduct business in the United States because they're not vaccinated.
So I've got a little secret for you. What you do is you fly to Guadalajara and take the train to Juarez, and or any number of border towns, and then you do what my friend you kind of go au natural, but then slink across the border and whatnot, and then you're in. Because the weird thing is we had an open border at the same time we were having these huge immunization. I misuse the term, state police or whatever, Stasi, checking, I need your card, your identification, whatever, your papers. And so at the same time, we're doing that at all the legal ports of entry. Anybody could just slink across, and millions at the time without any vaccination status. At the time that Mexico, for instance, and good part of Latin America, they were lagging behind us at the outset of COVID-19. So they were getting, a little bit, they were having waves after our waves, and those waves were washing, literally or figuratively washing across the Rio Grande to our shores with no circumspection, no surveillance, and no surcease. And it was just like, so it was kind of this unequal system. If you're part of the system and you have names and you have to go places officially and you fly on real airlines, you're treated more poorly than people who are just kind of shuffling across the border with, ostensibly pseudonyms and no papers. Anyway, I apologize for that digression.
No, it's right. And I think it's clear that the United States is an outlier. The fact that this is still in place. And of course, surely the UK Foreign Secretary should have been insisting, or not just the UK Foreign Secretary, but the foreign secretaries of every nation should have been insisting that reciprocal arrangements be put in place from the United States. We've been allowing US visitors to visit the United Kingdom since the regulations were eased, well over a year ago, and yet these restrictions still remain in place for foreign visitors to America. I was, during not just my most recent experience, seconded to the government, but for the last 2 decades, as I mentioned, visiting America on a regular basis, often in order to do business, to forge business deals, to ensure that special relationship was enhanced both sides of the Atlantic. And now for absurd reasons, I'm not able to travel and represent the interests of both American and UK clients. That is patently absurd and is detrimental to the economic health of America. So I just cannot understand why it continues to happen.
No, it's crazy. I've got 2 examples off the top of my head. One is Djokovic, Novak Djokovic, number 1, 2, or 3 tennis player in the world in a given moment. He couldn't play in the U.S. Open, and I think he couldn't play in the Australia Open either. This is a guy who's fit, top health. I mean, if I could stay at Djokovic health for the rest of my life, I mean, I don't know, that'd be priceless. Anyway, and clearly I'm sure at that age and so forth, he probably already had COVID, experienced it, natural immunity, blah, blah, blah. And we wouldn't let him in the country. Again, he should have shuffled across the border and entered the tournament as Djoko Nokovic instead of Novak Djokovic, whatever. Or just the Joker, I would think his nickname, whatever. And then he would have, maybe shuffled in and unseated and taken the world by storm with a beard and glasses or something like that.
And he's one of the great heroes emerging from this. You couldn't have written it better. The fact that he went to Australia, was essentially deported out of Australia, and then returns the following year and wins the Australian Open. This guy is a hero.
Yeah, absolutely. And here we have this kind of stratifying, divisive figure, Kyrie Irving, who's a top basketball player, and he's an interesting guy. He's a little bit spacey in some ways, but he made a personal stand that he was not going to get vaccinated, and he was actually completely correct. I don't agree with Kyrie Irving about everything, but he was completely correct about this. And he couldn't play his basketball games in Canada when they played Toronto for a while, and he couldn't play. And weirdly enough, he could play in Indianapolis. He could play in Los Angeles. He was on the Brooklyn Nets, New York City, but he couldn't play in New York City. It's like his own. So he could only play away games except in Canada. There's one team in Canada, and he could not play in Brooklyn. Now these guys are totally, they're in their own world. They're not milling around. They're not on the subway. All kinds of. They're driven in by limo, whatever. And there's no way or no reason. And mind you, he's completely healthy. Obviously, he's healthy enough to play in Indianapolis. He's not infecting people there. People showing up in the stands in Indianapolis, but for some reason they couldn't do it in Brooklyn, New York. And I'm from New York City. And we always pride ourselves being, the center of the world and knowledge and all that. The New York Times. It was always like that's the kind of the financial capital and presumably the intelligence capital, not like military, but regular kind of capital intelligence of the world. And it's like so backward. I mean, it's like. It's upside down land, no logic at all. And in New York City, just to finish this little digression, New York City, wanted to have these cards that you couldn't get into. You had to have your vaccine card updated to get into a restaurant or get into a store, or get into this and get into that. And weirdly enough, and oddly enough, and ironically enough, the population that was the most vaccine fearful was the Black population, followed slightly by the Latino population, both of which are reasonable fractions of the city, and so it became one of these things where the intersectionality kind of like the vaccine cards trump racial identity and the history of racial inequity. And these were themes that were kind of coinciding because of the George Floyd incident and whatnot. So restaurants were in the business of turning away, and again, about 75% of New Yorkers, Black New Yorkers at the time, would not get vaccinated, and I think 75% of white New Yorkers would get vaccinated. So it became kind of this racial divide. And so, anyway, it's just, heads were exploding and all this kind of stuff. So I'm not sure where the question is in that one, but.
Well, it actually raises a thought in my mind, namely that there's a very, very good researcher, if I could describe him as that. He probably wouldn't like to be described as a researcher, a guy called Joel Smalley, who I've been working with for the last sort of 3 years on and off. And Joel is very good at analyzing the COVID-related data. He and I collaborated, for example, on the creation of a little video back in, I think it was January 2021, where we looked at the so-called spike in deaths as a result of COVID. And we then looked at previous years to see if there had been similar spikes in deaths, excess deaths. And in fact, there were many years. It wasn't that the COVID so-called pandemic spike was vastly greater than others. But Joel and I most recently collaborated on production of a video where he had used Johns Hopkins University data, which compared COVID morbidity post and pre the vaccination program. And obviously it showed that the most vaccinated nations tended to have the worst outcomes in terms of death numbers. But he's also done a recent analysis. His Substack is called Dead Man Walking, by the way, because he tends to focus on death data. But one of the analyses he did looked at deaths in Black and other ethnic minority populations that had a lower uptake of vaccination. And of course, the outcomes were much better. The least vaccinated tend to have the least excess death numbers. So a good Substack to have a look at. He's a superb researcher and produces wonderful content.
Yeah, no, I was honored by him. He reposted my Hugh McCarthy interview, and it's a compliment that was really touched me. He said, "This is the type of interview the BBC should be doing. Thorough and interesting, and with the And I agree with him. not that level of compliment, but I do agree in the sense that the BBC and other U.S. stateside outlets do not do in-depth interviews, especially if it's with Hugh McCarthy. And Hugh McCarthy, as I guess mutual friend, you probably know him in person. I don't. I know him through virtual, but we've had great discussions. He's a brilliant man, and he literally cares about the children. He's a former head teacher, and there's kind of we entered upside down world in so many different ways, but the inability to have any discourse. I'm going to leave one sidelight. It's in the news right now. Jon Stewart from The Daily Show. He's a comedian, a pretty bright guy, but a man of the left. And he kind of had a falling out with Stephen Colbert, who was his previous underling, acolyte, and he gave Stephen Colbert wings through The Daily Show. And Colbert's got his own late night show, and they were on a year ago, and they were talking about, I don't know how it came up, but Wuhan as the origin of the Wuhan Institute of Virology as the origin of coronavirus through a lab leak. And Colbert turned stone-faced and kind of attacked him and so forth. And I don't know what the interplay was, but Stewart says that Colbert tried to cancel him. And I'm not going to get into their internecine battles, but this is indicative. What happened when he just mentioned something blithely, which is turns out most likely to be true, and it was true then. It was true at the time, and so on. But the BBC or the CNN or whatever, they don't put anything out there that would be contrary to this kind of lockstep lockdown narrative. And so it requires both bravery and external resources to fight on and to carry the message. Hugh has been superb at that. He's tenacious, and and if people are watching this and haven't watched your Hugh McCarthy interview, they absolutely should. I met him kind of indirectly because he had been on a BBC radio program. He was invited in, obviously at that stage it was in the middle of COVID, so I think he was phoning in via Zoom or whatever onto the program as an invited guest, as an expert guest on this phone-in program to talk about the interventions and the effect that they were having on children. And his particular focus is on masking children. And, at the time in the United Kingdom, children were required to wear masks, even in classrooms and en route to schools, and if they were traveling on public transport. And Hugh was in the studio and was explaining to the interviewer that this was disgraceful, that, and particularly for children who had perhaps learning difficulties or had, or maybe suffered from deafness, they were attempting to lip read it and so on, but also really just for the rest of the class, that person-to-person interaction, non-verbal
communications were lost, obviously, if both teacher and children were masked. So he was making this point on air on a live BBC radio program, having been a head teacher and teacher for decades. And they literally took him off air mid-sentence. The guy who was hosting the program said, "I'm not prepared to sit and listen to this." And I was in London at the time on business, and somebody sent me a link to the interview, and I listened to it and was absolutely astonished. And so I contacted Hugh and asked him if he would come up and do an interview, really just to give him an opportunity to say what he was going to say had he not been taken off air. And I'm going to call out the guy who'd hosted the program as a BBC reporter called William Crawley, who does both national and local radio programs in the United Kingdom. So they took Hugh off air mid-sentence. So I said to him, "Right, Hugh, come to my house. I'll record an interview with you on camera and give you the opportunity to say what you were going to say." And we put it up on YouTube. Now, the BBC is part of an organization called the Trusted News Initiative. And what they do, can you believe the irony of this? You know, so the Trusted News Initiative at that time involved Google, obviously YouTube, its subsidiary company, and at the time Twitter. I don't know post Musk whether Twitter's still involved, but essentially it was a sort of, and Reuters, and the BBC, and various others.
All the trusted news. Obviously.
Absolutely, yeah. And clearly, somebody at the BBC had contacted YouTube, told them that I had posted a video, because it couldn't have happened otherwise, because I don't really have a big presence on YouTube. And they took down the interview, the recorded interview that I conducted with Hugh, and posted it. It had only got to something like 800 views before they pulled it off
Wow.
that platform as well. So the extent of it, of censorship was, now it's a bit better now because of Musk and Twitter.
Somewhat. I got to tell you, I have an interview with Randall Levy, who's an MIT professor, and you know he's also in Israel from time to time. But he's an analyst. He's a management and risk analyst and a former intelligence officer, et cetera. And he's come to the, I think, quite logical conclusion that the risks outweigh the benefit for the vaccination across the board. I mean, there's no on the disease side, SARS-CoV-2 is long gone, and it doesn't exist in any human. The original ancestral version is not there at all, and that was the worst one. I make analogies, so I apologize, but my analogy is that's a wolf. Okay, wolves don't rely on people. I mean, they might eat them, but they don't rely on us the way dogs do. And so all of our dogs ancestrally were wolves at some point, or coyotes, whatever. And they came across, and then we cared for them. They have a relationship with us. So a zoonotic virus that lives in other animals can come out and attack you like a wolf can, the way a schnauzer or a Weimaraner won't, because they depend on us. So what happens is the wolves come in and they take your kids or whatever, they zip off. They don't need you. But once they're in just the human population, they have to acclimate, because we'll kill them off preferentially, or if they kill us off, we segregate that area. And I don't want to get into the kind of the ecology of the situation, but in point of fact, what happens is they migrate down and they become less and less lethal over time. So what we're left with now is we have maybe not quite pit bulls, we have maybe German shepherds in terms of Omicron or whatever, that might be dangerous to some people at some point, but overall they're benign and trained. So common cold viruses emanate from some other new novel virus that was kind of more vicious and so forth, and they have to kind of acclimate to the population. So a common cold is not going to succeed by killing off its host. It wants to succeed by passing around and not knocking you down too much. So anyway, I apologize for that, but in point of fact, this doesn't exist anymore, and you can't say it. So my Randall Levy show, I put up on YouTube and the natural, usual suspects, and I put it up on LinkedIn as well. And LinkedIn sent me a warning today; they've pulled it, and this because he's talking about vaccination. So this is still part of their kind of groupthink outside of Twitter and outside of Rumble, which was never part of this kind of trusted news source thing. They still, you have to put the word vaccination up there, they'll kill you. I've been booted off of YouTube a few times. I've been getting these community warnings, and Facebook, same thing. Community standards. What are these? Which community is this?
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's why I got a note from Substack yesterday, outlining Substack's model and the fact that the community in fact does police Substack, because you build your own community. Mm-hmm. I have thousands of subscribers to my YouTube. Joel has tens of thousands, I believe, and clearly, if you're not writing content which is appropriate for the community that you have built based on your own particular focus area, it might be quite esoteric. Obviously with COVID, we've built up relatively large communities because some of us, I suppose, are prepared to speak out, and therefore, we know that we're preaching to the converted. There is no requirement on the part of Substack to interfere in that process of communication, because by default, the people that are reading the content want to read it and want that provocation and alternative viewpoint. But you're right, and it's clear that this sort of corporatism is that there's Kate Wand in Canada has done a great job in terms of some of the videos that she's done for the AIER, and I know that Jeffrey Tucker at Brownstone has been doing a lot of work in this area as well, about the relationship between corporations and government, and essentially they're almost one and the same thing these days. And it's clear that, given that trusted news initiative and the proximity of for example, Google to the US intelligence services and so on, that government and the establishment and these corporations are all really...
Yeah, no, and it's funny. That is the essence of fascism, and not to kind of minimize fascism, but originally the fascia was the symbol of the Roman Senate, and it's the taking individual sheafs of sticks or whatever, you put them together, they're stronger than one stick breaks by itself. You put them together, they form a fascia. That's why we have fasciitis in our feet and so forth. So the fascia is a benign thing by itself. It's a strength by grouping together. But then Mussolini came up with it because he wanted to rekindle the Roman Empire in Italy, and then it became something else. So, but fascism, the essence of fascism is corporatism. Is basically having the big corporations and the state, anneal and line up together and do things together. And so the state, obviously, it's you're getting rid of for the private companies, you're getting rid of competition basically, and for the government, you're bringing a source of kind of regulatory capture. You're bringing money into the government so that you'll be nice to those. So anyway, so they get stronger and everyone else gets weaker and has to basically bow to them. And that is the essence of fascism. When we hear about Antifa, which is theoretically anti-fascist, they're not really going against this aspect. And what we've seen, again, from kind of the left, historically, it was supposed to be question of authority, but when they got to be the authority, it's no longer, there's no more questions.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And we're seeing the same thing here happening in the UK at the minute. There's a lot of public sector trade union activity, that despite the fact that many of these public sector workers are, essentially guaranteed a job for life, they're all clamoring, for wage increases, and so that they can pay their massively increased gas and electricity bills. But meanwhile, there was an announcement today on the BBC that up to 2,000 pubs across the United Kingdom are about to close. This is on the back of some 15,000 hospitality outlets, I think, have closed over the last 3 years, during the so-called pandemic. So the private sector, individual small businesses, family businesses have all been going to the wall. And meanwhile, the trade unions are getting closer and closer to big government and corporations, and really feeding again from the same trough. So suddenly the whole left-right dynamic in politics has gone away, and it's very much a case of the individual versus big state, big unions, big corporations. And you're right, it does very much feel like the kind of neo-fascism arising from coronavirus. And of course, emerging from coronavirus, we're seeing, net zero arguments. The Ukraine conflict is beginning to feel very much like it's a conflict orchestrated by the arms manufacturers, and it all seems to emanate from this sort of centralized, corporatized, big government center of control. Yeah. And the individual seems to be losing all agency in the process.
Absolutely right. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I try to, I hunt for facts and so forth, but I do believe in this thing, which is a kind of a meta aspect of conspiracy. I think there's a conspiracy of interests. So, I don't think that, everyone got together, Bill Gates and Xi Jinping or whatever, and whoever, I don't know, Soros, and they got together and said, let's put a virus out, and we'll this, and it'll happen. We'll have, one world government. I don't think that's the way it happens, but I do think that things happen, and then people, agglomerate. I think it's more like an ice cream cone. You're walking around with an ice cream cone. The ants aren't thinking about your ice cream because it's not even in their world, and so forth. When you happen to drop the ice cream and it's on the pavement, all of a sudden ants become very interested in your ice cream, and they group together, and they, I assume, try to keep all the other, everyone else away. They want to get as much as possible because it's an event. So I think there has to be an event that kind of breaks something. And then people congregate like the ants or whatever to get their fill of it. And so, in this particular instance, I think any of these steps could have gone in certain ways. But when when there was this event in Wuhan, I'm not sure. I don't think it was planned. I think it was a genuine leak, and it affected Wuhan first. So I don't think China would have wanted that. But once that happened, then there were, WHO kind of folded in China's way, minimized it and so forth. And then it so-called, it just happened to happen in Italy, which is an aged population, Bergamo, whatnot. And then it happened in New York City and Queens, which is the most polyglot place on earth. Yeah. And people don't necessarily, kind of communicate with each other as well as they might. And they're in subways and they're in elevators and all this kind of stuff. So it happened in the most densely, polyglot part of New York, of the United States first, and people saw kind of the worst things first, and happened in one of the oldest, demographics in Europe, which is an old demographic to begin with, and so I think there were just a kind of few coin tosses that went the wrong way, and then, and I do think there was this kind of, then it became this conspiracy interest of people who wanted this thing to kind of carry on and build up steam for their own power.
I think you're right. I don't even think, it may well be that, the lab leak theory is obviously becoming, and particularly with the Senate subcommittee on COVID, happening, the Jay Bhattacharya and Kuldorf and so on have been talking at length about the lab leak idea, and I think the evidence is growing that almost certainly was the case. But to some extent, it's a bit of a red herring as far as I'm concerned, because the excess deaths were largely caused by government interventions. There was the huge fear campaign, obviously. The fact that so many elderly people in hospitals, and this happened as much in the United States as has happened in the UK, were moved from acute hospital facilities into care homes, and then there was the midazolam morphine cocktails that they were given rather than being given the normal interventions that would be offered for respiratory disease. They were essentially euthanized. And and today, just today, I'm not sure when this is going out, but today being the 1st of March. There was a major article series announced in the Daily Telegraph, one of the major newspapers in the United Kingdom, and they essentially are using a series of leaked WhatsApp messages between the health minister Matt Hancock and various other parties in government in the United Kingdom. And the lead story today was about the fact that Matt Hancock had ignored the advice of the Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty, in terms of the movement of elderly patients from hospitals into care homes, in that he had ignored the advice from Chris Whitty that they should be tested for COVID before being allowed into care homes. But of course, we were every evening in the United Kingdom, and probably in the States as well, we were being told the number of cases that were occurring in the UK. And these were asymptomatic cases mostly, probably 95% asymptomatic. And yet the case numbers were going up and up and up. And this, of course, was the reason why we should all be panicking. So the narrative continues that all of the interventions, from the testing debacle to and tracing and the mandates and the social distancing and the vaccination programs and all of these things, without even the reference or need for a novel virus, probably would have resulted in massive excess deaths anyway, regardless of Wuhan or lab.
I don't want to do this experiment, but maybe, this just occurred to me. You could do the experiment of, I suppose maybe prison, but you could do the experiment of no virus and locking people down and doing social distancing and so forth to see what the death rate is. I mean, inevitably, it's going to go up.
Absolutely.
The QALY, what it is, I don't know if it's quantity adjusted life years or quality adjusted life years. The QALY of the lockdown exceeded that from the presumed lives saved through COVID. And part of that is just in heroin, narcotic fentanyl overdose itself. That category, the median age of death from overdose, I think, is like 37 years old in the U.S. If you're a narcotic addict, you may not be as productive as the not narcotic addicts, but still you're losing, say, theoretically, I'm not sure what their ordinary life expectancy would be, but let's say it's 80, like everybody else. You're losing 43 years of maybe not full quality, but whatever, the life you could have had, clean and so forth. And there were, I think, in the order of I think between 30 and 60,000 excess narcotic deaths in the U.S. during the lockdowns, and that totals up, when you add up the 40 years lost per, that added up to higher rates of QALY, of life years lost from coronavirus, which was hitting a median age of death at 82.
Yeah. So
those people, they were mostly, 45% of them were nursing home, which has a median age of life expectancy about 13 months if you're in a nursing home or that level of illness. And so, those deaths total up as, 1 or 2 years lives, 1 or 2 year of life lost. And anyway, so leaving the math aside, this was always a crazy equation. If you did this, absent a disease, you would definitely see an increase in mortality.
Absolutely. And as you know, in the United States, there's a huge track history to this as well. 76% or something of US television advertising is for prescription drugs. And, we don't have that in the United Kingdom, admittedly, but still, the drug companies seem to be very effective at getting people hooked on their products.
Well, that's brings up two things. You mentioned Jay Bhattacharya and Martin Kulldorff. And I've had Jay Bhattacharya on my show as well, and he's a wonderful man, erudite, great speaker, and so forth. But there was this recent Project Veritas video, the Pfizer video, which has been expunged and so forth. You couldn't play it anywhere. It was never shown on the news and whatnot. But between the Collins Fauci emails about Dr. Bhattacharya and Martin Kulldorff and Gupta in the UK, they wanted to expel them. They wanted to kick them out of the public square, and they wanted to have the community standards. They were basically putting out a kind of a Goebbels-like governmental misinformation campaign, a smear campaign on them. And the question, it brings up the question why. And with the regulatory capture aspect that was brought up by the Jordan Walker Project Veritas video, that's one thing he mentions, that we at Pfizer are able to dangle goodies in front of the regulators, and we can get things done because they know they're going to be on the board, or they're going to get a job with one of the drug companies afterwards. This has proved true. In the case of Scott Gottlieb, I think he's on the board of Pfizer, and there's the coincident aspect of patents and money coming through the NIAID and NIH through some of the Moderna and Pfizer patents for the mRNA vaccine. So there's a huge money flow, which is coincident in a sense with the essence of what we were discussing earlier.
Yeah, and life-changing amounts of money, a gargantuan amounts of money. On the newera.uk, my Substack, I wrote an article about the Moderna IPO, even just and of course the timing was very convenient, wasn't it? You had them working on mRNA vaccines, and then the lead, I'm working so closely with the US government on the COVID vaccine, essentially having the research and development undertaken, and then the IPO and etc. And people made vast amounts of money, and of course, it may well be that certain parties in government made fortunes from that, and we're yet to hear the full detail. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I'll leave it at that as well. But did you see the Woody Harrelson clip from Saturday Night Live?
I did indeed. And it was beautifully slipped in, wasn't it? It was just sort of pushed in there very gently.
Well, I don't think they were expecting it from him, because he's kind of a leftist, and I mean he's I think what he calls a hillbilly communist or something like that. So I think his roots are Middle America someplace. But he's a skeptical guy for whatever reason, and he gives for people who haven't seen it, they should go check it out. It's easier to see it. But what if you locked what if drug cartels locked you up for a year until you bought the drug? Well, fine. This is exactly the situation people were put in. They couldn't have any of the other normal aspects of treatment during the lockdown year. It was all shut down. And again, I don't know if ivermectin HCQ work. I think ivermectin is more likely to. I think there's better evidence for it, and very likely it does some palliative aspects.
And the call to action, though, you had these absurd, particularly aimed at younger people who clearly weren't worried about COVID. They weren't, even if they got it, they wouldn't really suffer any ill effects, and children as well. But the calls to action, get your vaccine, not because, it's really, really important that you get this because it'll save you, from this terrible disease. No. Get your vaccine so that you can travel, so that you can go to clubs, so that you can go to raves, so that you can maybe get a free burger.
Yeah, no, it's crazy. No, and it worked. It worked. I mean, there's an old poster. The beatings will continue until morale improves. Mm. And so they were going to beat you until you decided that your morale was going to improve according to their standards. This is told just to kind of, it's not quite related, but a little bit. During that summer when things opened up, we were in downtown Boston. They were partying, kids were running around like crazy, blah blah blah, and Omicron was just on the horizon, I guess. But Rochelle Walensky, who's the current CDC head, she was actually being grilled by the Washington Post about a year ago about all the problems with the CDC, and she was saying that they said lockdowns and no lockdowns, that they were wavering back and forth without the science, and they said, well, at least Rochelle Walensky had a reason for putting lockdowns or masking, excuse me, not lockdowns, but putting masking back in place. And that was a study on Provincetown with no masking, and there was a big outbreak of Omicron. And I guess that was probably late 2021. That kind of like really it singed my ears a little bit, because this is crazy. That Omicron is like I was saying with the wolves and the schnauzers, Omicron's a schnauzer, and guys in Provincetown, they do a lot of funky stuff, and they're close at very interesting junctures and so forth. So there's going to be a spread of an illness. But the question was what she took was a thing that showed there were a lot of cases, as you mentioned, of Omicron after this Provincetown when things were loosened up and so forth. And it's like, well, I'm not positive it was Omicron. It might have been Delta or whatever. But one of the strains that was a lesser, it wasn't the wolf variety, and people, nobody died from this, and so they all got sick and they got sniffles and whatnot. Which, okay, fine. But then she puts masks on the entire country from looking at something that happens in Provincetown. And I don't need to tell people that Provincetown is not the United States. It's an unusual place. Look it up and so forth. A lot of things happen on a kind of speeded up basis that don't happen in Omaha, for instance. Or it might happen in Omaha, but not as frequently. And so this was always a misapplication. It's really looking for something. It's kind of the princess and the pea. If you're looking for something to bother you, you'll find it. And we have a lot of, you have your own problem with princesses over there. But and maybe that would be the for Megan's sequel to Spare, maybe the princess and the pea. But people look for things that would kind of like allow themselves to do this, draconian, to quote you, overreach, and it's just really craziness. I don't know.
You're right. And when Omicron was announced, of course, and I think it was isolated, if indeed it was. There's I have a big question mark over the whole virology science as well. Again, I've written a few posts about this, because obviously the entire narrative has to emanate from the isolation of a virus, and of course the causality is assumed. They take throat swabs from some people who suffered, with COVID in Wuhan, and they take the throat swab and they're able to meticulously isolate the causal virus, that causes this terrible disease, and then that's sequenced and that becomes the basis of the PCR test, et cetera, et cetera. And without that kind of little itsy bitsy, and I think one of the geeks in Panda determined the sort of data load that there was in the spike protein, SARS-CoV-2 virus, and I can't remember the exact number, but it was something like in data science about 73K. So could a 73K of data load in a little virus result in sort of instantaneous disease right across the globe? The biggest ever pandemic we've seen in human history, or whatever it was described as. Right. So but assuming that this is the case, that we can isolate the virus and say definitively that this is the cause of the disease. Omicron was isolated in South Africa, and it was described by the researcher who had isolated it as being very, very mild, bit like a cold. And yet everybody ran around like headless chickens. Instead of saying, this is good, might result in immediate herd immunity if it spreads like Delta. But no, instead, we all have to get masked up again. We all have to get locked down again. We all have to do all this nonsense again.
I wrote an article in the Daily Skeptic, which I think is a great article. It's something that nobody wrote.
Randall, I'm sure it is. I'll read.
Omicron is not a lineal descendant of SARS-CoV-2. So the alpha, beta, et cetera, delta, kappa, all these lambda versions, the variants of concern, the VOC from SARS-CoV-2, those were basically, descendants. They were children, grandchildren, nieces, whatever. They were all from SARS-CoV-2, ostensibly, genomically. But Omicron is not. There have always been coronaviruses. As long as humans have been around and other animals, there have been coronaviruses. And coronavirus is the second leading named cause of common cold in 1999, in the before times. When SARS came along in 2003 and thereafter, that is a coronavirus, but not every coronavirus is SARS. And not every so some coronaviruses are MERS and SARS-CoV-2 and Delta and so forth, but not every one of anyway, you get the point here. So Omicron is just a coronavirus, in my view, and it's just doing coronavirus stuff, which is common cold level stuff. And people are treating it like it's COVID-19. It is not even a relation. It's not COVID-20, COVID-2020. So I wanted everyone to rename COVID-19 to, just coronavirus or whatever, or, the common corona, or whatever you want to call it, but it's not, Omicron is not that. And to keep giving the vaccine under the same EUA emergency use authorization statutes is one further aspect of this cronyism we're talking about between Pfizer / Moderna, whatever, and governments. And there's no reason to do it anymore. There's no reason to make a bivalent.
Do you not agree that, Randall, that they seem to be assuming that everybody, given the fact, that prior to March 2020, everybody was very reliant on very intelligent, very articulate, very well-researched people making observations about what was going on and depending on them increasingly. Well, certainly up until probably about 20 years ago, universities were seen to be centers of learning, and that the experts that, not anymore, obviously, but surely they must have realized, and perhaps that explains the reason why they did have the censorship program, that people like us, particularly people like you, from the medical and fraternity, would have come up with an argument to say, excuse me, I don't actually follow your train of thought. I think this is possibly flawed. This is ludicrous. And therefore they needed the censorship in order to literally silence us. But I think they're beginning to lose that war now.
It is. And, as per Groucho Marx, I would never belong to any group that would take the likes of me as a member. But so I've been somewhat
I never used to go to the World Economic Forum because I really didn't want to spend time with that type of person.
No, I appreciate that. And so, I've been kind of a lone wolf type cowboy, whatever, through my career. And that's been both good and bad. I'm not going to, go over my highlights, but it is kind of what and who I am. But it's not been, my views. I've been consistent. I have, I've got 3 years of videos, most of them, just my monologues before I started doing kind of this interview pattern. And I can document my thought process, and I can have emails and letters to, my colleagues and friends and all that kind of stuff, and my congregation and whatnot. And I've always been the one guy saying this stuff. And it's a little bit like Cassandra. Nobody cares. Nobody listens and so forth. Anyway, I'm going to close, I think we're kind of rounding out the hour here, and I want to kind of put up your Substack and ask for some final words. But before you do that, I'm just curious on a personal basis, like what's given you the courage and power to maintain integrity?
I said, but it's unfortunate. It's a bit like Hugh McCarthy. He's got to that stage in his career where he's able to speak up, and I think I've got to the stage in my career where I'm not dependent on a salary coming in every month, in order to pay my mortgage. I don't have a mortgage any longer. It's just a function of age, and therefore I suppose I've been able to maintain some degree of integrity, largely as a result of that. And I've found that many of the people who have been involved in the resistance, as you described it, would be of a similar ilk, or they just don't care, or they have very partners who can afford to pay the bills. So I'm very grateful for the fact that I've had a career that essentially has funded my ability to speak out. But I would just encourage people to, I was a great fan of the works of Nassim Taleb, like Black Swan.
Until you see him on an airline with like 3 masks on.
Oh no, exactly. That's the point. Exactly the point I was going to make. But one of the points that he would make in the book is that if you don't have free speech, not able to speak out and express your view, and be a free thinker, then essentially you're a slave. And of course, then he goes and kind of capitulates and gets all.
Well, he didn't just
a little embarrassed.
So I'm okay with his capitulating. What I'm not okay with is his screaming at everybody else who's not capitulating.
I know he can be utterly arrogant, and I didn't expect
we arrogant people don't appreciate that.
No, I totally. But the point he does make well is, that we have to be able to identify black swan events as well and determine which are genuine black swan events. Yeah. Was COVID-19 a black swan event, or was it something else? Was it something made to appear to be black swan to frighten the bejesus out of us?
This is my swirl of conspiracy of interest, and I'm going to segue that into to our mutual self promotions. So I'm going to just show for all the people at home the New Era. This is the newera.uk. I recommend you check it out. You'll get Jeffrey Peel or Jeff Peel.
Yeah, just one hint that because it's on Substack, it's www.thenewera.uk. Okay. For some reason, if you don't put the dub in with Substack, it doesn't seem to work. But yeah. And there's a lot of stuff there. A lot of interview. Like I've interviewed, people like Naomi Wolf and Jeffrey Parker, and wow. And there's a lot of long form content. And as I said, the before and after video I would recommend watching, which is the one I referred to earlier, that was based on the COVID deaths before and after the vaccination across 190 countries, based on the Johns Hopkins University data set that I worked with Joel Smalley on. So I'd recommend that one.
All right, absolutely. So I'm going to let you link those as we put this up on Twitter and so forth. My own, let's see, I try to do my own self-promotion here. Where did it go? Oh, here we go. So I have a book, Overturning Zika, the Pandemic That Never Was. You can find it on Amazon. I think the price just went down. So you can save a few bucks by buying it now. So this is Zika. People might forget it was 2015-16 Brazil. Microcephaly from mosquito bite, virus called Zika, which is really a version of dengue. That's my name up there. That's a picture of me in the morning. Anyway, I think people will find some interesting analogies and so forth of what happened there. A lot of the same characters. You got your Dr. Fauci, you got your CDC, you got your WHO, and all this stuff. And people jumped on the conspiracy of interest theme is coincident with that I don't think anybody wants children to have microcephaly. But once it was there as a potential or as a conjecture, it got mushroomed into fact by trusted sources and so forth, because it coincided with an interest to overturn Latin American, Brazil abortion constraints. And so the left really just went nuts over the judicial system and so forth to get emergency abortion approved, and a lot of money and interest came along for this cause. That's a secondary aspect to it, but at the base of it, there was very little science, and in the tumult and a panic, alternative voices haven't been heard. And in the aftermath, there's been so much money devoted, billions of dollars towards Zika microcephaly, that nobody in the establishment wants to cut their own research funding off. So a lot of things coincide with this, and there's going to be a vaccine as well, and God knows whether it'll be mandated for 1 billion young families throughout the tropics, and there are a lot of them, and they all still working under the belief that Zika microcephaly is a real correlation. Anyway, I'm going to cut it off at that. Any last words, Jeff?
No, it's just been a pleasure talking to a like-minded person, Randall, and continue doing all the wonderful things you're doing. And
I appreciate that. It's vice versa. I've got to make it to Belfast sooner.
Yeah, please do. Yeah,
and I'd love to have this again. So I have an open invitation for you anytime, because you're a joy to listen to.
Oh, you're very kind. It's been a pleasure.
All right. So thank you very much. You can hang around for a second. We're going to say goodbye to everybody else.
Okay.